Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. On behalf of Tariq, the History Association of Mehchan Mahajan Devi College for Women, Punjab University, Chandigarh, India, I welcome you to this special lecture by the acclaimed art historian, Dr. Ursula Weeks. My name is Chandani Jaswal. I'm a first year postgraduate student of history at the Punjab University and the former president of Tariq. I'll be moderating this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, for accepting our invitation. Before we begin with the lecture, I invite Venus Thakur, student of BA 3rd History Honours, to introduce the college. Over to you, Venus.
Mehchan Mahajan DAV College for Women is a postgraduate institution affiliated to the Punjab University, Chandigarh. It was established in the year 1968 in the memory of great luminary Justice Mehchan Mahajan, the third Chief Justice of Supreme Court of India and the former Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir. The college imparts holistic education to over 5,000 students spread across multidisciplinary fields. Its vision and mission is to inculcate ideals of integral humanism to students who can become empowered catalysts of national growth and social construction. It was in the year 2018 that the college celebrated 50 glorious years of its completion, and this was graced by the then President of India, Sri Ram Nath Kovind. The History Department of Mehchan Mahajan DAV College has organized itself into an association called Tariq, which organizes lectures with reputed guests like you, ma'am, from time to time, and also other various activities for students. On behalf of all the students, I extend a very warm welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Venus. Now I'd like to call upon Dr. Mini Garewal, Senior Faculty Member and Associate Professor at Mehchan Mahajan DAV College for Women, to please introduce our eminent speaker to the audience. Mini ma'am.
Thank you, Chandni. It's a privilege for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ursula Weeks. She is an independent art historian based in London who specializes in Mughal and Rajput paintings and in Indian history and culture. Dr. Weeks was educated at St. John's College, Cambridge, and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, which is one of the most prestigious colleges for the study of the history of art in the world. She lived in Delhi for 7 years and has taught at the National Museum Institute and at the School of Arts and Aesthetics in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is currently writing a book on Mughal court painting in India for Reaction Books Limited. The topic for today's lecture is In and Out of Time, Mughal Portraiture. We are very thankful to Dr. Weeks for sparing her time to enlighten us on this medieval form of art, and we look forward to a very interesting and enriching session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mini ma'am. And before we begin with the main lecture, a few cardinal rules for the audience. You're requested to ensure that your microphones are switched off for the duration of the lecture. After the completion of the lecture, we will have the Q&A round. You're requested to put your questions in the chat box and I will be taking those up later. And now, without further ado, the moment that we've all been waiting for, I now invite Dr. Ursula Weeks to give her lecture. Ursula ma'am.
Thank you so much. I am so honored by this kind invitation to speak to you today. And I loved that introduction about the college itself and what a fantastic institution. And so I want to extend my warmest gratitude to all the faculty members for this very, very kind invitation. And also to Chandni for reaching out to me initially. And she's a very inspiring person. So thank you for your moderation of this session. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and just let's give a moment for that transition. And we're playing from the start. So I've put your amazing logo in and this Golden Jubilee celebrating 50 years. That is wonderful. So our subject today is In and Out of Time, Mughal Portraiture. And I've chosen that title because it conveys the way in which portraits operate in their own time, and for the audiences where they are sort of the paintings are made for, but portraiture always operates across time too. And that, in a sense, is our vantage point. We are sitting here in the 21st century and now looking back on Mughal culture and able to access the individualities and personalities of people from that time. As you know, I often, when I'm speaking to audiences, I know there are many undergraduates, and including first-year undergraduates here, and so you will not necessarily be experts about Mughal painting, but you will have some knowledge about the Mughals, and you will know that, you know, they are a branch of the Timurid dynasty, who in the early 16th century are basically seeking a new territory. And it's at this point in 1526 that Babur basically expands his territorial conquest into the Indo-Gangetic plain, and he takes control of what at that time, up to that time, had been the Delhi Sultanate. Now, it takes a while for Mughal painting to really get going, because Babur, though he's incredibly interested in the world, and his memoirs are one of the most important works of autobiography in the early modern era across any culture, he prefers to draw portraits with his pen than through his artists. And in fact, no painting at all survives from the Mughal period in their sort of first stint in India between 1526 to 1540. We don't have any surviving paintings from that period of Babur and Humayun's first period in India. Then, as you will know, Humayun has a period of exile where he's unable to maintain control of India. There are so many different factions, and this is the period of Sher Shah Suri, where he really takes control and lays many important administrative foundations that the Mughals then build on when Humayun regains India in 1555. But the story of Mughal painting really begins during this period of exile for Humayun. And in many ways, Humayun has been seen as a weak link in the Mughal dynasty. But in fact, many important aspects of ideology and soft power, if you like, develop under Humayun, and also develop as a result of this period of exile, because he takes refuge at the court of Shah Tahmasp, in the Safavid ruler of Iran. And while he is there, he encounters the incredible painting atelier that Shah Tahmasp has there. But in a way, fortunately for Humayun, several years, so Shah Tahmasp helps Humayun gain control of Kabul, and he sets up his own court in Kabul from 1545, and he has about 10 years where that is his kind of seat of power. Shah Tahmasp then decides to completely disband his atelier. He has a sort of religious experience that makes him become much more orthodox in his Muslim faith. And so he decides to get rid of his painters. And Humayun profits from this by basically absorbing some of the painters from Shah Tahmasp's exquisite atelier, and they come to work for him. And this is where Mughal painting begins, in Kabul at Humayun's court. And this is one of the earliest datable Mughal paintings that dates from around the period 1546 to 1549. And it already shows how the Mughals were very interested in the idea of portraiture embedded within the image. This is a work by Dost Muhammad, who is a late Timurid painter. When Dost Muhammad was a young man, he was actually taught by the great Persian painter Behzad. And so we have this connection directly into the kind of, really high period of late Timurid painting. And what you're seeing here is Humayun seated in a landscape. He's celebrating the festivities for the circumcision of his son Akbar, who he had recently been reunited with at this point. And in the lower third of the painting, you can see Humayun. He's seated in this kind of rock platform, but you can see how the landscape is sort of molded to be like a throne. So there's this platform and the bolster that he sits on, as it were, but it's all this rock platform. And he's here with his brother, probably his brother Hindal here, and other male members of his entourage, all in this lower third of the painting. Halfway up the painting, we see a group of women here, and there's an unbroken axis between Humayun, who's dressed in green and orange here, and this woman over here dressed in green and orange also. She's being offered a flower, and so it seems reasonable to suggest that she is Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu Begum. And then up in this area of the painting, you can see these three little children playing with two nursemaids. What's fascinating about this painting to me is that we see this incredible Persianate landscape, all in the vertical format of the Persianate book arts. And in fact, it is filled with lots of kind of hidden forms that contain metaphors. So here you can see an elephant, and this is symbolic of Humayun's desire to regain India. Over here, you can just maybe make out the figure of a mother with a kind of baby sitting with its legs, its arms and its legs going in the air. And again, this is expressive of the importance of Hamida Banu Begum within the image. But the thing that interests me so much is that right at this very beginning of Mughal painting, the dynastic presence of Akbar is not really in the little real children, as it were, playing up there. It's in this image that Hindal is handing over to Humayun. So it kind of takes us right at the beginning to the fact that there's an interest of images within images. This is a very reflexive image in that regard. And the dynastic presence of Akbar is, as it were, contained in this little portrait that is being handed over to Humayun. Now, I want to address with you, how did the Mughals feel about the kind of Islamic prohibitions against figural representation and portraiture? Because this is a question that I'm often asked in connection with the development of Mughal portraiture. And in fact, the prohibitions against figural representation are not so much within the Quran, but within the Hadith. And they were interpreted very differently by different Muslim cultures over the years, and particularly within Persia, where there had been a very strong tradition of manuscript and artistic production prior to the Islamic conquests. Always within those cultures, there retained a very strong emphasis on representation within their artistic practice, which they found different ways of justifying. And I'll come on to that a little more as we move forward. I'm just going to break for one moment because the wind is banging the door in my study and I want to shut it. Okay. Now we won't be, hopefully, so I won't be so distracted by that. So let me talk to you a little bit about the antecedents of Mughal painting and how and why they developed this interest in observed portraiture, because really Mughal painting is one of the first Islamic sort of artistic cultures that develops a really concerted practice of observed portraiture. And inherent in Mughal art is the idea of hybridity and drawing in art from different cultures and making something uniquely Mughal about it. So on the one hand, you have the whole tradition of Persian painting. And in a sense, that has been represented to us already by that Dust Muhammad painting, that the first artists who are employed by the Mughals come from the Safavid or late Timurid courts. And so that foundation is really grows straight out of what's going on in Persian art in the 15th and early 16th century. But then coming into India, as they come into India very quickly, they draw on Indian artists to come into the Mughal atelier, particularly under Akbar in the late 1550s and 1560s. They're recruiting very heavily from local Indian workshops. So on the top left, you can see a page of the Nimatnama. This is one of the most important Sultanate manuscripts of the late 15th, early 16th century, made at Mandu. It's this amazing kind of recipe book that's full of recipes for biryanis and for curries, and also for pan and for perfumes and so on. And in each of the illustrations in the Nimatnama, we see Qiyas al-Din, the Sultan of Mandu. He's presiding over all of these productions that are being made. And so there's a real sense of identity embedded within those Sultanate paintings. Sultanate painting obviously has strong connections to Persian art that are being developed. But then we also have the workshops working for Hindu patrons. And that's represented in this lower left of the slide here by a beautiful manuscript made just at the moment that the Mughals are really getting established with their art in around the 1550s, 1560s. This is Sada Bhagavata Purana. And here you see Krishna, he's stolen the clothes of the gopis. And really although there isn't a real practice of portraiture going on in pre-Mughal Indian painting, there's a very, very strong sense of characterization. And this goes back all the way to manuscripts, texts like the Chitra Sutra of the Vishnu Dharma Matara, where, different kinds of figural types, different types of women, different types of men, different ways of depicting certain hierarchies of people are all very, very clearly laid out. So there's a real sense of characterization, even if it's not portraiture. Then in the middle, where I've just written Hamzanama, this is a magnificent page for the Hamzanama. This was Akbar's great project, his first great commission of a manuscript that contained 1,200 huge, large size paintings that were all done on cotton. They were definitely intended to be sort of performed by storytellers at the court. And this is one of the few pages where we actually see Akbar's identity almost sort of projected into the figures here, because the central figure here seems to be almost like a reflective portrait of the young Akbar. And the Hamzanama is the real point at which we see a Mughal style definitely beginning to be self-consciously developed. And one of the reasons that Akbar is so interested in investing in the artistic production of his court is because of this desire to distinguish themselves from the Safavids, or even from the Ottomans as well. And this is one of that sense of competition is one of the reasons that you see such a distinctive, unique style developing within the Mughal court that begins to draw on different artistic influences. Then, so the Hamzanama page there is probably around 1570. On the right-hand side, I'm just giving you a development of how this carries forward in painting under the Akbar period, because the page on the right-hand side is a page from the Vienna Akbarnama that's made between about 1590 and 1595. And this is the great chronicle of Akbar's reign, and this is the copy it's actually only a part of volume 2 that survives, but this was the copy made for Akbar himself. It's the first presentation copy, and we know that Akbar himself chose all the depictions to be illustrated. This page shows the submission of Raja Sujan Hada, who gave the Ranthambore, he submitted the Ranthambore fort to Akbar. I think this is in about 1564, something like that. This event occurs, and this is one of the first really major forts of Rajasthan that Akbar kind of, you know, gains control of, with then the Bundi rulers, the Hada rulers, the Bundi rulers, basically becoming suzerains of the Mughals. But this is a particularly interesting page because through the Akbarnama, you can see a development in portraiture, but the one figure who always has an iconic likeness through the Akbarnama is Akbar himself. But then there's a kind of emerging portraiture in the other figures. So there are many naturalistic figure types, but it's not always easy to specifically place who each of the courtiers are in the Akbarnama, in a way that it becomes very easy to do so later on in the Shah Jahan period. But I like this page here because you can very clearly identify the figure of Tansen here, just leaning over and clapping, and also the figure of Naubat Khan, his son-in-law, playing the veena. And by this point, we know that during Akbar's reign, Abul Fazl writes in the Akbarnama that Akbar decided to make a huge album of all the grandees of his realm. Ellen Smart hypothesized that perhaps Akbar was dyslexic. He was famously known not to be literate, to read and write, and she wondered whether one of the motivations behind this great portrait album was to assist in making appointments across as the administration of the empire, the bureaucracy of the empire grew. But certainly we do have these small formats of portraits that survive, and in the National Museum in Delhi, I'm afraid I haven't put it into this PowerPoint, there is a lovely portrait of Tansen that probably is related to that portrait album, and he's seen in exactly the format that we can see the artist here is picking up on. Oh, here's a little close-up. I forgot that you would be able to see that. Now, one of the most interesting artists who's right on the cutting edge of the development of portraiture at Akbar's court is the artist Manohar. He is the son of probably the greatest of Akbar's artists, an artist called Basawan. And Manohar begins to develop not only the album portraits are always single portraits in profile. What Manohar begins to develop are kind of almost like conversation piece portraits. And he is really the kind of first artist, I think, who develops a sense of group portraiture, which becomes then so important in the 17th century. And we know that Manohar had a very close relationship with one of Akbar's sons, Prince Murad. And these are wonderful portraits that both date to around 1595 that show Murad with either his wife or a consort, and they have an amazing sense of tenderness about them. And they already, this is a theme I'm going to pick up on later with you, but they already alert us to the idea of not only a portraiture of men going on at the Mughal court, but also the more problematic issue of a portraiture of women. So whether these are real sort of identifiable women, they're certainly idealized, but there's a great sense of tenderness in their entwined bodies here. I love how his arm comes right around her and then his leg is underneath her body. There's an incredible sense of sensuous, their interwoven bodies, is it, like, if you like, here, and then you have the wine, and then they have their pan here, and then these beautiful flasks and trays of drink, all set in a kind of garden setting. And then this lovely portrait that's in the National Museum, also with a great sense of tenderness between them. And Murad at this time, Akbar in the 1580s, I think, can't remember the exact date, but Akbar appoints Murad to be the head of all the karkhanas, all the workshops. And we know that he is assisted, his sort of right-hand man in doing that is the artist Abdus Samad, who is one of those original artists that came from Shah Tahmasp's court. And Manohar and Murad may well have been of a similar age at this point. And so perhaps that explains how they formed such a close bond. But it's interesting to see that the development of portraiture is not just going on within the Mughal court, in the imperial court itself. This is a very important manuscript, the Chinar Ragamala, which is made in 1591. There's a colophon. A colophon means a kind of, inscription in a manuscript that tells you the date it was completed or who the owner was and so on. And a page from this Chinar Ragamala tells us that it was done for the Bundi rulers, the Bundi Rajputs, when they were governors at Chinar. This was an appointment that they had been given by Akbar, and that it was completed in 1591, and that it was completed by 3 artists. And they say that they had originally been trained by Mir Said Ali and Abdus Samad in the Imperial Mughal atelier. So these are 3 artists who had joined the Mughal atelier. Their names, Sheikh Hussein, Sheikh Hatin, and Sheikh Ali, show us that they were probably Muslims, but they are part of the first wave of artists who seem to get sort of dispatched from Akbar's atelier. So Akbar's atelier grows to have a huge number of artists, and then towards the end of the reign, it begins to thin down. Very famously under Jahangir, he then thins it down much further to probably about 30 artists at a maximum. So these are artists who have had to go and find a new patron, and they find a new patron in this Rajput Hindu ruler who's a Mughal governor in Chunar. And he commissions them to make a Ragamala. And in this particular page of the Ragamala, we see how the Raga figure has the portrait of Bhoj Singh Hada, sort of, or it could possibly either be Bhoj Singh or his son Ratan Singh. And it seems to be like his portrait that is being portrayed there. So we see the way that you get a kind of displaced portraiture in some of this painting being patronized by Rajput rulers, by very high-ranking sub-imperial rulers. And we see something similar with the artist Nur Muhammad. So there are a number of artists who are kind of working on the edge of the imperial atelier. And Nur Muhammad is a great example. We know that Nur Muhammad worked for Hamida Banu Begum. Hamida Banu Begum was a great book lover. She had a library of her own. She was a great patron of the arts. And now it's now in Doha, the Ramayan that belonged to Hamida Banu Begum, and that we know she requested to see it just a few days before her death. It's fascinating. There's an inscription in the manuscript, an inspection note that tells us that she requested to see it just a few days before she died in 1605. One of the artists who worked making the illustrations for this Ramayan for Hamida Banu Begum, later on we find, quite soon after, starts to work for Raja Rai Rai Singh of Bikaner. And this is a beautiful portrait by Nur Muhammad of Raja Rai Rai Singh. So, here we're seeing this Rajput patronage of very closely observed portraiture. The Bikaner rulers, they had intermarried with the Mughals, and where you find these close alliances between Rajputs and the Mughals, there tends to be a more Mughalized form of Rajput painting there. Then it has these lovely inscriptions, and these actually come from the 18th century when an artist, one of the Usta artists of Bikaner, called Mahmud in 1739, was reusing this portrait. So this is like a study that would have been kept in the workshop for the artists, and he was making a later copy, and at that time all these little inscriptions were written on, describing all the colors and different types of fabrics that should be described in the painting. So this just shows you the whole development of portraiture that begins to really take off at the very back end of Akbar's reign and into Jahangir's reign. Now, Jahangir was even more interested in images, in portraiture than Akbar. Within Akbar's reign, you know, so much of the portraiture is confined to this lost album, but then also to the Akbarnama. But as soon as you move into Jahangir's reign, he's much more interested in producing albums and sort of individual images than in this, you know, huge projects of serial illustration for narrative texts. And one of the key figures here, Manohar, we've already talked about, and he carries right over into Jahangir's reign, developing a lot of the group portraiture in the early period of Jahangir's reign. But also, very importantly, is Abul Hasan. He is one of the most important artists of Jahangir's reign. Now, Abul Hasan never worked for Akbar. He is the son of Akariza, who was a Persian artist who came around 1585 and joined straight as the head of Prince Salim, his workshop. And Akariza, the father of Abul Hasan, is the leader of Prince Salim's workshop when he sets up a rebel court with a very vibrant artistic atelier in Allahabad, in Prayagraj. And here we see a painting that is done by Abul Hasan as a teenager. He's probably about 16, 17 at this point. And it's a portrait that dates from this period at Allahabad, where he's handing a painting to Prince Salim. And this is such a fascinating portrait, I think, because it shows the very close connection between patron and artist. We see this beautiful enclosed setting on a pavilion, and Salim is kneeling down and he's pointing as a great connoisseur at the artwork that he is being given. And Jahangir later writes in his memoirs, he sort of boasts of his skills as a connoisseur, saying that, you know, he can tell this eyebrow is painted by this artist, and, you know, the lips are painted by that artist. So he takes great pride in being able to know the hands of each of the artists in his atelier. But one of the things I find so fascinating about this work is how Abul Hasan, as he hands the work to his patron, he doesn't let go of it. And so very visually, we see this connection of touch between Prince Salim and the artist here. And so it just emphasizes that very, very strong connection that existed between them. And that'll be important as we look later on at another of Abul Hasan's works. Under the Jahangir period, we see an interest in this kind of idea of images within images. So Jahangir, in fact, the painting that we started with, the Dost Muhammad painting of Humayun in the landscape, that is preserved in an album put together by Jahangir. And Jahangir was very, very interested really in what all the artists working for Humayun were doing. And many of the paintings that survive from the Humayun period survive because they were collected, preserved, mounted in albums by Jahangir. And so right at the beginning, we saw that little image within an image of Akbar being presented to Humayun. And really that interest in images within images is something that gets picked up again under Prince Salim Jahangir's patronage. We've just seen it in that Abul Hassan portrait, and now we're seeing it again in a very important work that establishes the kind of moment of portraiture, the idea of the moment of portraiture in Mughal art. This is a painting that is made for the Jahangirnama. Whereas the Akbarnama certainly was finished as a project, the Jahangirnama perhaps never was fully completed as a project. We have about 30 plus paintings that survive, all in quite dispersed locations. Now, the largest single group is in the Raza Library in Rampur. And this is a page, though, from the V&A Museum that shows the submission of Rana Amar Singh of Mewa. So the Mughals, for a long period under Akbar, had been trying to secure the submission of the Udaipur rulers, who very famously resisted Mughal overlordship for a very, very long time. But then in 1615, a campaign led by Shah Jahan brings about the essential sort of neutralization, as it were, from the Mughal point of view. It brings about an entente cordiale, at least, between the Udaipur rulers. But the Mughals treat them with incredible respect. They recognize how significant that moment is, and they agree, for example, that the Udaipur rulers will never give their daughters in marriage, and so on. But this is the moment of Rana Amar Singh giving his submission to Shah Jahan. And embedded within this is a self-portrait of the artist Nanha. And he shows himself in the act of drawing the portrait of the Rana here. So, of course, this is a constructed reality. Every work like this doesn't just, it's not like a photograph of what happened. It's like a construction of a reality that happened. But here we see that he's, as it were, establishing the idea that he's taking the portrait live as it happens. And so it's capturing this idea that a portrait is located at a particular time and moment in space. There's a brilliant, there are several brilliant articles on portraiture, and the great B.N. Goswami has written about this, and also the wonderful artist and art historian Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh. And they both speak about how within a Hindu tradition where you have this more cyclical notion of time, the accident of your appearance at a moment in time is less important than the essence of your being. You know, what really counts is the essence of who you are. And so therefore, within a more Hindu conception of portraiture, capturing those qualities that express your inner essence is more important. But in a more linear notion of time, as you have within the sort of Muslim idea of time and of existence, the idea of who you are in the moment of time is more important. Now, this is a very famous page from one of Jahangir's albums, from the Gulshan album, that shows a series of portraits of those artists who are the kind of highest ranking artists within Jahangir, Prince Salim's atelier. This is a page that is done by Dowlat. Here we have Dowlat, and you can see he's just drawing a portrait at the top of his page. He's written here his signature saying that this work is by him. You can see all the materials of the artist laid out here. And then you have all the key artists of the court. Here we have Abul Hassan, who is shown deeply engaged in his work. He's a young man. We have... let me get the right order. I believe this is Manohar here. There's also Govardhan and Bishan Das, but I think this one is Govardhan and this one is Bishan Das. And so this is a lovely kind of, you know, little detailing, if you like, of how the status of the artist continues and continues to rise, and the confidence, the sense of these embedded self-portraits becomes more and more present in Mughal art as we move through the Jahangir period. In a sense, this is part of, you know, the sort of celebrity status that these artists have within Jahangir's court. It's a reflection of that. One of the things I find really fascinating about this page is why Mansur is not there. And I have a personal theory that there was a big standoff between Mansur and Daulat, because Jahangir praises Mansur so much. And we know even from this period that Mansur's status at Jahangir's court was you know, very substantial. And in fact, Mansur is the artist named by Jahangir more than any other in his memoirs, and yet he's not in this page. So you never know. You know, we can only speculate about these things, but the potential rivalries that also existed within the Mughal atelier are quite present in that sense of absence as well here. So let's just summarize where we have got to, because on the left hand side I'm showing you a beautiful work that is in the LA County Museum of Art, which is considered, it's by Mir Said Ali and is considered to be a self-portrait just at the moment really of Mir Said Ali coming to India with Humayun. So in that work we see a beautiful sense of the individual figure, but very much still within this kind of quite generic model of an ideal Persian youth here. The reason that we can surmise that this is a self-portrait are from these inscriptions, which give quite precise historical details that enable us to place it as a self-portrait. And then on the right hand side now, moving forward into Jahangir's reign, we have this very naturalistic, closely observed idea of the portrait. This is a work that I love on the right hand side, showing Inayat Khan. This was sold quite recently on the art market, on the London art market. And but one of the things I would also say, although you have this movement from a much more sort of generalized, generic kind of sense of individuality into a very naturalistic individuality, the portraiture of the Mughal court never becomes really corporeal in the way that European art is. You know, they never really want to establish the really fleshy presence of the body that you have in European art. And there's very rarely any sense of a shadow cast by a figure in Mughal art. And so in that sense, the image remains within its own world, if you like. It's never brought down fully into the realm of just material appearance. And the Mughals didn't believe that. They didn't want to make a kind of optical experience of the person in the way that European art often seeks to do. They wanted the image to remain as part of its own world. One of their most important justifications, when you look in the Aini Akbari and in the way that Jahangir writes about image making, they develop a very Neoplatonic idea about the image, that everything in the visible world relates to archetypes in the spiritual world. And sometimes the kind of incredible finesse of the naturalism and observation is almost microscopic in its detail, in an attempt to, I think, express this idea that it's pointing to an underlying truth about the figure. Now, one of the reasons that I like the portrait of Inayat Khan is that he's holding this little image of a Portuguese kind of soldier here. And it does show this engagement with European art. And certainly the arrival of European art to India plays an important role in the development of naturalistic portraiture and the idea of presence within the portrait. Here is a lovely close-up of that portrait. And a while ago, I had the great privilege in Baroda of looking through the collections in Baroda, and they have a magnificent portrait of Jahangir. It's not very well known. It has some elements of overpainting, later painting, especially in this landscape that you can see and in the sky. But the core of it is a Mughal painting dating to about 1612. Where Jahangir likewise is holding a little portrait of a Portuguese soldier. Notice Jahangir is not wearing pearl earrings, and he always starts to wear pearl earrings after 1614. He got very ill in 1614 when he was in Ajmer, and he prayed to Sheikh Muinuddin Chishti for his recovery. And then after his recovery, he pierced his ears and said that he was a bonded slave of the Khwaja. And so after that period, you will see Jahangir with pearl earrings. But I love the interconnection between these two images together. And actually at Jahangir's court, I think he uses the reception of European art as there's a kind of close circle around him. And you know, wherever the whole idea of taste and your aesthetic taste is very much about who's on the inside and who's on the outside. You know, it's a real tool for creating intimacy, and I think Jahangir uses that at his court, because we even see in you know, commentators of Akbar's reign like Badauni, they're deeply opposed actually to some of the practices of images that are being patronized and deeply suspicious of images. But I love this connection between, as it were, patron and you know, his senior courtiers, because Inayat Khan was one of his very close associates in the dialogue between these two paintings. Now, Inayat Khan, of course, is most famous for approximately 5 years later or so, when he was dying. He was deeply addicted to opium. And he requests permission to go ahead of Jahangir to go to Agra when he's on the point of death, and Jahangir insists that he appears for an audience before him. And Jahangir writes about this in his memoirs in 1618 of how shocked he was by the appearance of his friend, that he's just skin and bones. He compares him sort of to how artists depict Majnun in art, when the figure is just skin and bones. And then he says that he commissions, he asks his artists to draw his portrait. And this is the portrait that's drawn by Balchand. This is the study probably taken from life of Inayat Khan. And then afterwards, Inayat Khan used this study in order to make, if you like, a finished painting, a finished work of the portrait here. So you can see how the picture on the left is quintessentially the moment of portraiture, and it captures that idea that I've brought out in the title of in and out of time, because in a sense it's a portrait that very much reminds us of the act of drawing in the moment, the act of the portrait as a kind of performance that the artist does right there and then in front of the court. But it also, of course, announces, if you like, the absence of Inayat Khan, because after this, you know, the fact that he's on the point of death, it captures his presence in a way that makes us very, very aware that he died a few days later. And we know from Jahangir's memoirs that literally 2 days later he died. And so it captures what is true of all portraits, that they tell us about the presence of somebody. But in telling us about the presence, they stand in for the fact that that person is also absent. And I think this captures that in a very, very intense way. And in a sense, the process between the portrait study, which is in Boston, and the finished work, which is in Oxford, captures that even more. That you know, here we have the work that was taken at the moment, captured like that sense of in the Mughal court of direct observation being so important. But then the fact that you would then make that up into a finished portrait that then is placed in an album is the painting on the right is in an album that belonged to Shah Shuja in the 17th century. Shows how you're immortalizing Inayat Khan's identity for posterity, as a sort of lasting memorial. And even going back to what Abul Fazl wrote about Akbar's portrait album, they're very aware of this idea that those who, you know, that you're kind of granting new life to those who have already died, you're granting a kind of lasting presence. So that sense of portraiture and posterity is very significant. Now, I've already spoken about the Neoplatonic idea that undergirds portraiture. And here we have a beautiful portrait by Balchand again. And it's a wonderful portrait that captures the intense observation. I particularly love the details of the sashes, and we see how every aspect of clothing is so closely observed. Here there's this lovely Rajasthani bandani sash that he wears, and he's wearing a second sash, which is much more of a Persianate brocade. And then he's wearing these gorgeous mashru striped pajama that are textiles from Gujarat as well. So, and then probably he's wearing this beautiful cotton muslin that likely comes from Bengal. So in a sense, right on Jahangir's body here, you have a sense of the textile industry of the entire Mughal Empire on his body right there. But also Jahangir's mother was a Hindu princess and a princess of Amba. Her name was Harkabhai. And so you see that expression, if you like, of his Rajput identity as well as his Timurid ancestry. And in his memoirs, Jahangir writes about the quatrain he wrote on a portrait he sent to Ibrahim Adil Shah. We don't have the exact portrait, but it said, "Our merciful glance is always in your direction. Rest assured, in the shadow of our felicity, we have sent you our likeness so that you may see our inner self through our external appearance." And so it's embedded within that is this idea of these Neoplatonic types, that the outward appearance, the external appearance, is like a gateway into understanding the inner truth of Jahangir. And this becomes particularly important in the very famous dream portraits of Jahangir. And so I want to share with you just briefly about one of those dream portraits. And it's the very famous work of Jahangir embracing Shah Abbas. And this is a a painting that was done in 1615 at Ajmer. And we know from a little inscription on the portrait that it says that it was as a result of a dream that Jahangir had when he was at Nur Chashma. And Nur Chashma, or Chashma-i-Nur, is a site in a little valley just outside Ajmer, lying just beneath Taraga Fort. And I recently, when I was in India in March this year, was very fortunate to go out to Chashma-i-Nur, and we took a drone flyer, and this photo of me here is taken by the drone looking down on us. So Jahangir had built at Chashma-i-Nur this, it was a lovely natural spring, and then this is an area where there was a huge, in Jahangir's time, a huge pool of water. I think still in the monsoon time, the water drains off down over this edge into a pool down below that you can't quite see here. And under here is a natural spring that occurs. And Jahangir, in his way of kind of appropriating or marking his presence in the Indian landscape, he builds this huge grotto with a big pishtak. And this is a lovely marble inscription set into it that says that Jahangir came here. He renamed the place Chashma-i-Nur. And so the idea of the portrait is incredibly important in this work of art, because other inscriptions show that he went to great lengths to ascertain whether the likeness of Shah Abbas, the Safavid ruler of Iran, who he never met, whether that this was a true likeness of him. And it seems that for the painting to have its real efficacy, Jahangir wanted to know that the portrait was like a naturalistic likeness of Shah Abbas. It was painted at a time when there was a lot of tension between the Mughals and the Safavids over the ownership of Kandahar. I won't go into the historical reasons as to why that was the case. And I'm sure you're familiar with this painting, and you know many of the symbolic details, how they're standing on the globe. Jahangir is standing on this the lion. He places Shah Abbas on the weaker animal, the lamb, and the lamb is sort of being pushed off into the Mediterranean. One of my recent discoveries about this painting that I was sharing at the Jaipur Literature Festival when I spoke there earlier this year is how Jahangir inserts his own body right into the center of the Mughal alam, the Mughal standard, which was the Shir-ul-Khurshid of the lion and the rising sun. And nobody before has actually noticed the way in which Jahangir completely puts his own body right into the center between the lion and now not only a rising sun, but a fully risen sun. And so it just shows the way in which naturalistic portraiture was being combined with incredible amount of allegorical imagery to project a whole new kind of idea of visualizing of imperial ideology under Jahangir. But we also have much more candid portraits occasionally that survive of the Mughal emperors. You know, in the previous painting, you know, Jahangir is curating his image so closely. And by the way, this is one of the great masterpieces of Abul Hassan. And a work like this only could come about by the incredible close meeting of minds between patron and artist. You know, Abul Hassan is right at the heart of the Mughal court as he is thinking and developing this kind of imagery. But we do have one or two much more candid portraits of the Mughal emperors, and these are all small study drawings in the British Library, just on a tiny sheet. It's kind of on the corner of a little sheet. We have this little portrait study of Akbar, which is incredibly evocative because there are no trappings of royalty really here. And also Akbar was such a man of action. In the Akbarnama, you always see him in the middle of doing something. You know, he's riding an elephant, he's in the middle of hunting, or, you know, whatever. He's always a man of action. And somehow here, where we see him in this incredible moment of stillness as he looks down, and we can look at him, it captures a kind of, a moment where time seems to pause, to me. Then in the middle, we have one of the very, very few portraits of Jahangir that is a 3/4 profile portrait. So under Akbar's period, you have a lot of the 3/4 mode there. That is much more a Persianate mode. By the time you get to Jahangir's reign, really all the portraiture is becoming full profile. And that was very much a hallmark of a more Indian mode of depiction of individuals, and there are very, very few portraits of Jahangir that show him in this 3/4 profile, but this is one of them, and he looks incredibly haggard. It's dated quite late to this period when he himself, a bit like Inayat Khan, is addicted to opium and addicted to alcohol. And then on the right hand side, Shah Jahan, who creates his portraiture so carefully. I love this portrait of him where he's practicing firing with his matchlock, and you just see him in this incredibly relaxed pose with his bare feet, just sitting there, practicing firing his gun. Now I'm going to move forward a couple of slides, or we'll just take you. I'm just conscious that I might be running out of time, and if anyone can, I can't see any of you. I think you can see me, but how much more time would I have just for finishing off what I was going to share with you? Is it okay if I take a moment longer? I think I've already maybe gone over my time limit.
Oh, we are really enjoying the lecture, ma'am. So please continue.
It's very interesting. You should finish.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take maybe 5 more minutes.
No problems.
Here we see, again, I want to pick up on this idea of the presence within the portrait, because under Jahangir, they used the format of the Jharoka portraits to really encapsulate the idea of presence within the image. And this is partly a response also to framed portraiture from Europe. And again, it's picking up on those themes we saw right at the beginning of the lecture of images embedded within images. And here we see Jahangir, he's holding a portrait of his father. His father is also in a Jharoka portrait. And in fact, this little extra detail is an extra tiny little slip of paper that was painted on, added to the portrait. I think you can see how this was originally a Jharoka portrait and then it's been extended somewhat. Because they keep Akbar in the 3/4 profile mode, but Jahangir in the full profile mode, it enables this like meeting of their eyes across time. And so we see Akbar, he's handing this orb, and it's almost as if he's handing it across the image to Jahangir. And this ledge articulates a division, if you like, between them. But in articulating that boundary, it creates a mimetic pattern, a mimetic chain, if you like, from this portrait to this, and then from Jahangir to us as the viewer as well. And so we see this idea of presence embedded within the image. The Jharoka window always had these beautiful textiles laid over it. And in fact, in the Chester Beatty Library, there is a beautiful 17th century Jharoka textile. You can tell that it was intended for that purpose because, when it's hung over the ledge on both sides, it would hang in the correct way up for the design there. But this Jharoka portrait also began to be related to the practice of shast at first at Akbar's court, but then at Jahangir's court, most importantly. And here you see Asaf Khan, and he's holding a little shast. These shast are little portraits that were given to the especially close intimates of Jahangir. And in this portrait here by Abid from the Padshahnama, you can see a number of figures who are wearing either gold medallions that were shast, or this figure here has a little shast pendant portrait pinned on his turban with a little pearl. Even Sir Thomas Roe, the English ambassador, writes that Jahangir gave a shust portrait to him, a little portrait of the emperor. And under the Shah Jahan period here, you can see Mirza Muhammad Khan Safavi. He is wearing a little shust portrait of Shah Jahan in his turban here. And then you see how it, you know, the idea of portraiture that's used in jewelry develops a little bit separately also from the shast, but also interdependent with European medallion portraiture. And I love this tiny little teardrop portrait that shows probably one of Aurangzeb's sons. And again, a tiny portrait, probably the size of a fingernail here, which is so sweet, of this little laughing angel drawing on the medallion portrait mode. Now, finally, I want to come back to the theme of a portraiture of women. And this is a little early 17th century painting, probably done by a woman of the harem. And in a sense, it directly alludes to the issue of portraiture in the harem. We know that there were some female artists from some inscriptions on paintings. And what I find fascinating in this portrait is that the woman here, she is drawing, she herself as the artist, we see her clearly. But the woman that she's drawing is completely covered with her veil, and the veil is sort of almost drawn across her face, as if to allude to that kind of problem of portraiture there. One of the things I'm just realizing looking at this pavilion here is how closely it resembles the beautiful Akbar fort at Ajmer, where we know Jahangir had his court in 1614 to 1616. So that's just a thought that's occurring to me even as I speak to you here. But some of the most beautiful portraiture of women in Mughal painting comes in the early Shah Jahan period in a wonderful album that Dara Shikar made for his wife Nadira Banu Begum. And here we see a beautiful pair of portraits across the album page that shows Dara Shikar and his wife Nadira Banu Begum. And in a sense, contextually, we're able to suggest identities because of these the portraits, the identities of the women who are close to Dara Shikar, whether his sister Jahanara or his mother, and also Nadira Banu Begum. But I think there's a lot more work really to be done about the portraiture of women and understanding more clearly when things are just idealized types and when we might be seeing actual observed portrait likenesses. So I have taken a lot of your time and sorry for going on for so long, but I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you have now. And I'll stop sharing my screen now so that I can see you all as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, for this very, very insightful lecture. I'm sure students have a lot of questions. I know that I do. But before we officially begin the Q&A session, I request everybody to please switch on their cameras for a group photograph. I'll give you a minute. Thank you. More faces, please. Great. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And for your information, the feedback form has been floated in the chat box. So please be sure that you fill that before the end of the session. Okay, so whilst the students are typing their questions, ma'am, one doesn't get an opportunity to connect with the Dr. Ursula Weeks every day. So maybe I'll ask a question here. I'll be a little selfish and ask a question myself. And ma'am, I was wondering that since female, I'm sure that the painters did not have an access to the women in the royal harem. So how did they paint the paintings? Were they in at all in the likeness of the actual princesses, or was it entirely a figment of the painter's imagination?
I think that at times they may have received descriptions. So there are, for example, I think, one or two portraits that seem to suggest an observed likeness of Nur Jahan. There's a tiny little Jaroka portrait. There's a portrait of Jahangir. It's called D'Alliance on a Terrace. It's in the LA County Museum, and it seems to portray the same features, that she had quite heavy eyebrows, quite a thick-set nose, and quite thick-set lips. And for me, I do see a sense of an individualized likeness. Now, that is something that could come through description. I think also on occasion, the women, to some of the very closest artists, they may actually on occasion have seen a queen like Nur Jahan. There were sometimes occasions in the court where they were seen, or for example, at marriage ceremonies that were taking place within the harem. I think it's not inconceivable to think that on occasion some of the most intimate of the artists could possibly have been on the fringes of those occasions. But if we go back to the portrait of Jahangir embracing Shah Abbas, again, at that point, that was prior to the embassy where Bishan Das very famously goes to Shah Abbas's court and takes the portrait of all these figures. I think there was a sense of developing portraits from description as well. So it could have been from just verbal descriptions of the women that there was a little sense of idea. But obviously there's a massive amount of idealization and imagination that also goes into those portraits.
Ma'am, and now that we're talking about females, so do we also have examples of female painters in the atelier or not during the Mughal period?
There are one or two examples of female painters in the atelier. In the Gulshan album, we have a painter called Sahifa Banu. She makes a painting that's a very quite conservative copy of a portrait of Shah Tahmasp. We also have a painter called Nadira Banu, and she is apparently the daughter of an artist. She's trained. There are two paintings by her that we know. One of the inscriptions says that she was trained by Akariza, so it seems that she was an artist. She was an artist who was actually properly trained within the imperial atelier by the head of Prince Salim's atelier. And I have a theory. It says that she was the daughter of Mir Taqi, and one or two paintings in the Jaipur Razmnama are said to be by an artist called Mir Taqi. So I think she might be the daughter of a very minor artist within Akbar's court. So yeah, there are one or two examples of female artists.
Thank you, ma'am. I see that students are getting a little overwhelmed. So a little side note to the students, please don't be shy. You can switch on your cameras and you can ask the question directly. If you don't want to type your questions, or put them in the chat box, any way that you're comfortable with. Dr. Ursula Weeks, I've had the privilege of connecting with Dr. Weeks before during one of the lectures, and ma'am's really nice, and she gives the most wonderful answers that, as you can see. So please
Yeah,
put
don't
your
worry.
questions. Yeah.
I always like to say there's no question that's too stupid or anything like that. Don't worry about that. We're probably all, if you're asking the question yourself, probably somebody else is too. So you'll be doing everybody a favor to ask the question.
So whilst you putting your questions out there, like I said, Mama, I have tons of questions. So I have another question, and I was thinking that you did mention in the initial slides that the Mughal painters, once they were out of work, they used to go to the regional kingdoms. So
Yes.
So when they went to the regional kingdoms, did they also take along those typical Mughal painting characteristics with them? Or did that not happen and they completely switched over to the Rajasthani painting style, for example?
That's a very, very good question. So let's take that example that I was showing of the Chunar Ragmala. So we can see that they are taking across a lot of like Mughal influence into their artwork. First of all, in the vertical format that they're bringing, which is a very passionate form of the book arts rather than the horizontal format of earlier Indian painting. That sense of individualized portraiture, in a sense, the whole like setting was quite a Mughalized setting within that kind of the architecturally and so on. And yet as well, they're really drawing on Rajasthani painting traditions and Western Indian painting traditions too there, because, you know, some of the ornamentation or even the figure, you know, I was talking about it as a kind of prototype, almost proto portrait of maybe Ratan Singh Hada, but his eye is beautifully enlarged, you know, and so you see they're kind of blending in both ways. So there's very much a kind of reciprocal influence that comes across. But I think where you have the Rajput schools that become most Mughalized are the ones where there are very close relationships. So particularly with the Bundi school, and those three artists who go and work for Ratan Singh Hara, they actually, when Akbar then rescinds their governorship in Chunar, they return to the ancestral lands in Bundi, and they really like that's the beginning of Bundi painting, and the whole way that Bundi painting develops is very much a fusion of Mughal and Rajput style through the 17th century. And also, for any of you who have not yet been to Bundi, that is where you find some of the most amazing surviving wall painting anywhere in North India. So you must visit Bundi, and there's particularly in this one space called the Badal Mahal, there's some amazing painting in that room in particular. Same with Bikaner, it's quite a kind of Mughalized style. In a way, a slightly outlier though, interesting, is Marwar, because in Marwari painting, although they have a lot of close alliances with the Mughals, and Shah Jahan's mother is a Marwari princess, there remains a slightly more distinctive artistic identity. And certainly down in Udaipur, there are great pains to create a very distinct artistic identity, very distinct from the Mughal idioms, really.
Thank you, ma'am. I've also gotten a couple of questions via personal chat, and there's one in the public chat. So yeah. I'll read that out to you. Pallavi asks, I wanted to know if hues were used in the portrait hold some sort of symbolic value, as in the colors that were being used for the audience. Did they hold some symbolic value or not? Or was it just the dearth of resources that they used the colors that they used?
So one of the things about Mughal painting was one of the reasons that it was, you know, so influential and important was that they were actually drawing in a much wider range of pigments than had been used in Sultanate painting or in, you know, pre-Mughal painting at the Hindu courts as well. So there's this incredible richness to the stone and organic pigments that they're using. Now, at times, there's a huge significance in the colors of clothing and the colors that they're choosing in the portraits. So if we go all the way back to the Humayun portrait where we began, and I pointed out to you his green clothing, and you know, Humayun wore different color clothing for every day of the week according to the movements of the planets. And also in the original, like some of the historical sources, we know that when he went to celebrate the festivities of Akbar's circumcision, they all put on green clothing. And that was associated with the fertility that was being, you know, celebrated there as well. And so, you know, there is all this cosmological significance in the clothing. I think also there's a significance in it in terms of the faithful representation of different textiles. And I pointed that out when we were looking at the Balchand portrait of Jahangir, and the way in which, you know, there in that example, he's wearing that white jama. sometimes there's a very symbolic importance as well. So like often in the Akbarnama, you know, Akbar is portrayed wearing white or pale yellow clothing, and a number of scholars, I think starting with John J.F. Richards, have pointed out how you know, this is because it's drawing on the symbolism of light that was so important in Sufism. So the way in which the Mughal emperors drew deeply on the illuminationist theories of Suhrawardi in the articulation of their imperial identity. So then to be portrayed in white was like a reflection of being a light-filled being. So that's why Akbar has this, you know, quite a theme through the Akbarnama is his white clothing. And we see that picked up at different times in the Mughal, you know, with the later Mughals as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, for such a detailed answer. I am sure that Palvi has now understood the question that she's asked. Venus wants to ask that, did a good patron-painter relationship ever lead to creation of a biased or exaggerated perspective towards depicting life of the rulers through the portraiture? If yes, how does one as a researcher separate bias from reality?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I mean, I think, you know, an artist like Abul Hassan, you know, they're in the direct, I mean, all of these artists, they're in the direct employment of the ruler. And so, yes, they are both trying to convey exactly what their patron wants them to convey, but they're trying to even go beyond that in their ingenuity, because this is how you get rewarded as an artist. You know, if you paint a really clever, beautiful portrait, you know, the emperor's going to give you an elephant and 2 Arabian horses, and, you know, he's going to shower you with money. So they were trying to be really inventive and creative as well. And yes, this is all about an art, you know, especially like if we take the dream portraits of Jahangir, it's an art to project his image. Now, how do we separate that from reality? Basically, as historians, every source has its own bias. And so what we need to do is go and assess the sources from multiple different directions. So like, you know, if you were only to take the Jahangir embracing Shah Abbas at face value, you would say, oh, well, there were great relations between, you know, Jahangir and Shah Abbas, weren't there? But we know from other historical sources that there's all this, you know, tension over the ownership of Kandahar. There's a whole sub-theme going on there. So I think, you know, one of the things as a historian or art historian is recognizing that every source has a bias within it. And even we, as the historian or art historian, we have a bias. The questions that I choose to ask arise out of the context in which I am in myself. And so we have to even recognize our own place within that process of bias.
So, ma'am, if we could build on the question that was asked, so do we see examples like the examples that you mentioned, Mansoor and Daulat having a standoff? So, were there more examples of standoffs happening between painters because they were fighting for the king's good grace, maybe?
I mean, the problem is we don't have any kind of, you know, biography from any artist surviving at the time. We don't have the kind of, you know, kiss and tell kind of, you know, narrative from any of them. So, you know, what I said about like why Mansour being absent, you know, I mean, it's a complete speculation. I do have I've just been writing a section in my book about flower painting at the Mughal court, and I kind of wonder whether the standoff is partly around who is going to have Jahangir's and real attention in the as a natural history painter, but we don't have a great deal of evidence to prove, you know, everything you're going on such slender evidence. But another example like that is the artist Abid. So we know that Akariza was the head of Prince Salim's workshop. We know his son was Abul Hassan, and we know that Abul Hassan had a brother called Akariza, called Abid, but Abid is completely absent pretty much from the whole record of Jahangiri painting. But then he suddenly emerges on the scene right at the beginning of Shah Jahan's reign and paints incredible works for the Padshah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I can see that Shuchi has raised her hand. So, Shuchi, we will be coming to your question. There was another question in the chat box, and one of the student wants to know the writer's craft, and as in the resources that that an art historian like yourself use to build on the seminal work that you've been doing, or how do we as postgraduate or undergraduate students approach books or the sources that we have at hand, and then build on a
Yeah.
reasonable thesis.
Yeah, well, I think, obviously developing as an art historian depends on going and looking at the materials yourself as much as you can and reading widely. And, there are magnificent paintings within India. It's not always easy to gain access, especially as a young scholar. And I think that the internet is, and social media is a great tool actually now for you guys creating more of a sense of we must have access to these things. Sometimes on my Instagram, and by the way, I'd love you to follow me on my Instagram at Ursula Weeks. On my Instagram, sometimes, you end up posting things, and even probably in this lecture, a lot of the things are like V&A or LA County Museum of Art, and you can feel as a student in India that everything is overseas and I can't have access to any of these really important paintings. Well, the thing is, there actually are really amazing paintings in India, both in public collections and in private collections. The challenge is for you guys to create a culture where you actually have access to them. And I really commend all the amazing efforts that are happening, especially by a young generation and through social media, to actually increase that accessibility, which is fantastic. So go and look at the paintings, make the appointment at the National Museum in Delhi. Go to, even just in Chandigarh, you've got wonderful paintings in the museum right on your doorstep there. Go to the Raza Library in Rampur, and take a small group, or do it through these, Chandani's involved with Karwan Heritage, use platforms like that have so much attention now, to be able to develop your own visual skills. But then also read widely. And one of the things is there's so much on the internet available now. And that's great, because even if your libraries may not have all the best, all the books, you can normally find access to things. And even people like me, sometimes somebody messages me saying, I really need access to an article, and I happen to have a, copy of it, and I just send them a scan or something like that. I feel passionate that everyone should have access to these materials. So in terms of developing as an art historian, those would be my real advices.
Thank you so much for those words of wisdom, ma'am. And in the interest of time, we'll be taking the last question, and that is by Shuchi Gupta. Shuchi, you've raised your hand, so you can turn on your camera and your microphone and ask your question directly to ma'am. Shuchi, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was such an interesting lecture, and I came from your Instagram. I've been following you for a while. So my question was, as a beginner who has passion for history and has not much knowledge for art and paintings in general, what would be a good place to start to learn? As you said, we could visit these museums, but in reading, what would be the resources one should prefer?
Yeah, one of the things I wish I could say is read my book, because but it's not yet finished. But soon I'll say that, because there's actually a lot of the literature on Mughal art specifically is quite dense, or it's in exhibition catalogs, or there's a brilliant book that's Reflections on Mughal Art and Culture that's been published by Niyogi Books recently, which has really nice essays. But I think if you wanted just a really good general introduction to Indian art, like the book by Partha Mitter in the Oxford University Press series is a really nice introduction. I think on Mughal painting, I find very readable the works by Milo Beach, like Mughal and Rajput painting. It's quite old now. And then because I think other things, when you're kind of just starting out, there are so many things that are really, really dense, and then it's you get a little bit put off by that as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
you.
Shuchi. And thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, for taking all our questions so patiently. And
Thank
so
you.
on the behalf of Husanpreet, could you please maybe put your question to your teachers, and then maybe ma'am could take that up later? Or ma'am, could you take last question maybe?
Yeah, I can take a last question. Yeah.
Okay, so this is going to be the last question, everyone. How did the culture affect the Mughal portraiture?
Well, I think that it's two things. Is how culture affects portraiture, but it's also about how portraiture affects culture too. And partly the Mughals are using portraiture as a way of creating an integrated society where every individual has agency, whether of different religious backgrounds, of different social backgrounds. We didn't have time to look at, you have portraiture of wrestlers from the court. You have portraiture of those artists, they're servants of the court, but you also have portraits of noblemen, you have portraits of women, you have portraits of Hindus, of Jains. We didn't look as well at the portraiture of ascetics. So they're using portraiture as a way of bringing the whole society into the world of the court as well. So it's a reciprocal relationship.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I will have to be cruel here, and now we won't be taking any questions. So, okay. And so because Dr. Weeks is a busy historian, so on behalf of the principal, Dr. Nisha Bhargav, the head of department, Mrs. Poonam Viveshwar, the faculty and students of Mehchan Mahajan DAV College for Women, I would like to express my gratitude to you, Dr. Weeks, for taking out time and giving such an excellent, insightful and layered talk called In and Out of Time, Mughal Portraiture. And it was indeed an honor. I know that I speak for everyone here, an honor and a pleasure to hear you live. And so this marks the end or formal end of the lecture. Thank you so much, dear audience, for joining us. And on behalf of the students, I'd like to also thank our faculty members for giving us, always supporting us and making us, giving us the opportunity to have such lectures at MCMDAV. Thank you so much, dear audience. Thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, for joining us today. This marks the formal end of the lecture. I hope that you filled the feedback form, and now you can leave the lecture. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.